Welcome to the Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Knowledge Economy, sponsored by Woodard, building your ideal practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. I'm Ed Kless with my friend and co-host Ron Baker, and on today's show, folks, we're doing our best books of 2024. Hey, Ron.
Hey, Ed, how's it going?
Good. Always, as like last week, always one of my favorite shows, best books. You know, what's funny about this is that when we first started doing this, we included it in like the best of the year. And they were like, no, we can't get through books and all of the other stuff in one show. Yeah. The heck with it. We got to separate out. Books has got to be the one that gets settled. We get a lot of feedback on this show constantly from people. You cost me $300.
Well, hopefully we'll cost him some more today. So that's awesome.
Yeah. Well, let's get rolling, Ron. I think do you have a book quote? I didn't get a book quote ready for this year. Do you have one?
I don't. We should just rely on the one we pulled last year, but because that was a really good one. And I forget who said it, but yeah, we usually open with a quote. I completely forgot about that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay. So, since I opened the show, I'm going to take moderator privilege. I'm going to say you go with your first book. So,
okay. Well, Ed, this is a book we did a show on.
Number 5. This is number 5.
And I really think these all 5 of mine should be all number 1s because it's really hard to rank them all. I should have went in alphabetical order. I should have done this, but I didn't. Okay. But I'll just say The Case for Shareholder Capitalism by R. David McLean. You and I did a show on this book, episode 488 for Greg, called Wealth's Way, The Wisdom and Wonders of Shareholder Capitalism. I absolutely love this book because it reminds you of what you forgot from Finance 101. Mm-hmm. It's just, he's going back to the basics. He's laying out a very explainable, concise, cogent case for why stakeholder capitalism is just it's not workable. It doesn't work. Like, this reminds me of Reagan, what's wrong with socialism? Well, it doesn't work. Yeah. So some of his key arguments are just about profits in general. He said, profits are not, they're often understood, as you and I know, and have been banging our spoon on our high chair for years, about it's not a zero-sum world, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Both sides profit and shareholders eat last. And that's a really important point. And then he talks about the myths around long-term value creation. The idea that if Pfizer spent $14 billion on R&D, that, its long-term value would be destroyed, right? Because they expense that and the profits go down. But it actually went up, which tells you that shareholders do prioritize growth. And we see this in Tesla, Amazon, go down the list. I no longer buy that Wall Street short-term thinking. It's a ridiculous argument, because there's too many counterexamples out there. And the other big myth that I think he just does a beautiful job destroying, and we hear it to this day, the stock market's a casino. No, it's not. The stock market's about liquidity. Yes, when you buy an Apple share of stock, the money doesn't go to Apple, but what it does do is it assures liquidity in the market so that people know when they buy an Apple stock, they can turn around and sell it whenever they need to. And that's a valuable thing, right? As opposed to, say, having a share in a privately held company that's not liquid at all. And that's the value of the stock market. He destroys the myth around share buybacks. This is great when companies give the money back. It doesn't raise their stock value. It's not manipulation. It's so the investors can take that money and put it to higher growth opportunities that the company itself can't seem to find, so that the investors take it. And that's how we get money plowing into all these new ventures that we're funding, AI and medical technology and all of that. And of course, he does a great job critiquing ESG, and just he says, basically it's subjective, it's disconnected from any economic outcomes. And he warns, that Joseph Schumpeter prediction that capitalism's success sows the seeds of its own demise. And we've talked about that before, but capitalism it relies on mutually beneficial exchanges, accountability, and the long game of wealth creation. And my favorite just one-line summary from this book is, on average, investors want more wealth than less. Even the people that are willing to sacrifice ROI, right, for a good purpose or whatever, that doesn't mean they want you to lose their money. They're willing to take a less return, just not maximize. But nobody wants to lose money in the market, and that's why we have shareholder capitalism and superior stakeholder.
Yeah, no, that was a fantastic book, and I think we've tried to get him on the show. If not, maybe that's something that we should visit in 2025 to see if we can reel him in to try to talk directly to him. But it was, great stuff. Great stuff. Well, my number 5 book, Ron, this year is a book, in fact, that you and I talked about with somebody yesterday on a call we had, and that is Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. And this is a book the Will Guidara is he's not the owner. He was, I guess, general manager is the wrong word, managing partner, something. Of 57 Park Madison, which is a fantastic restaurant, ended up being at some point the restaurant of the year. The book starts out with them being named like the 50th restaurant, and they went to this big thing, and they were thinking, oh, maybe we're going to be in the top 25. They were number 50 of 50, and they felt disappointed in that. And then what did they need to do to really drive toward being the number one? And look, there's in this book is very similar to stuff like that we read back in the 80s and 90s. If you remember Carl Sewell's book, Customers for Life, great book, and talk about all of these different things that his organization did to ensure customer success. We have lots of stories from Disney, the Disney cast member who gives the kid the balloon or whatever when she drops the ice cream cone and all of this stuff. So this was a refresh of some of those great stories. My personal favorite from the book was one where their KPI, one of their KPIs is whether or not people show up to their restaurant with luggage or not. And because what they assume, and correctly so, especially in New York City, is if they have luggage, that means that they're their first stop or their last stop before they're going to the airport or coming from the airport. So it must be an important part of the trip. And so they pay attention to that when people check luggage at the front desk. And there was one time when they did that, and the wait staff overheard that these folks joking that, hey, we've done everything in New York. We've had these wonderful culinary experiences. We saw Wicked or whatever Broadway show, and they went to the Met, all of the stuff. The only thing we didn't have is a dirty water hot dog. Ha 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 ha. And they're all laughing. And so the waiter overhears this and goes out and purchases a hot dog from a street vendor, finds it, brings it back to the restaurant, brings it back to the chef, who's like, what are you doing? He explains the situation. The chef puts it on the counter, cuts it perfectly into 4 precise pieces so that they're exactly the same size, plates it, and then puts ketchup and mustard on the plate to do little decor. And the waiter comes out and says, well, we didn't want you to leave New York without experiencing one of our culinary delights, and that is a dirty water hot dog. And they put it down. They go absolutely insane. They're just, of course, they'll come back to the 57 Park Madison forever, right? Just based on that experience alone. But what a great story. Right. And, here's one of my favorite quotes from this, because we have talked about this as one of our myths. He says, the customer isn't always right, and it's unhealthy for everyone if you don't have a clear and enforced boundaries for yourself and your staff as to what is unacceptable behavior. And I think that that's such a really, really great insight. And the other one, the last one that I'll share with you on this is that he calls it his rule of 95-5. He says, manage 95% of your business down to the penny. Spend the last 5%, quote, foolishly. It sounds irresponsible, but in fact, it's anything but, because that last 5% has an outsized impact on guest experience. It's some of the smartest money you'll ever spend. Now, I don't know if I agree with the 95-5. I think in the restaurant business, that might be the case because their margins are so razor thin. I think for a professional organization, it's more like 80-20. We talked about Google time, where they give 20% of their time over to whatever they want to work on. But just a lot of refresh. So it was really just a fantastic book, well written. And if I could put a plug in for listening to it rather than reading it because it is read by the author and he does a fantastic job. It does not sound scripted. It sounds like he's telling you this story. It doesn't sound like he's reading a book. It sounds like he's letting these stories unfold. And it sounds more like a presentation than it does a book. So.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was a fantastic book. I read that too. I think I read it the year before, though.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, a few things, and I know our conversation yesterday about this too, when this book came up. The thing that's always impressed me about studying TQS, and I'm going back to, the 80s with this terminology, total quality service, is you're exactly right. It's the little things that make the biggest impact. And I think you said this yesterday when we were talking about it. When those people left that restaurant, probably on the flight home, and when they tell friends that story, they probably spent $1,000 on that meal. Ed, what are they going to talk about? The hot dog. I mean, it blows my mind. And Paul Dunn used to say, 80%, yeah, watch it to the penny, do efficiency, blah blah blah. But the other 20%, be frivolous. Paul
Mm-hmm.
Dunn said that all the time. And I love that. I love that philosophy. The other thing that strikes me, my other favorite line from that book is when he says, customer service is in black and white, but hospitality is in color.
Mm-hmm.
That says it all. I
Yeah.
mean, that elevates service to an experience right there.
Right, right. Yeah, there's lots of nuggets of wisdom in here. A couple quick ones. Start with what you want to achieve instead of limiting yourself to what is realistic, scalable, or sustainable. Right in our wheelhouse, right? And I really like this one too. And it made me think, and I had to think back on this. That sometimes the best time to promote people is before they are ready.
Mm-hmm. To stretch them and
And,
get them
and
out of their
it's
comfort
and it
zone.
certainly is true that it is far better to promote them before they're ready than after they've become stuck and complacent in their current position.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right,
Yeah.
because then they've already sown the seeds of, well, I've outgrown this position, and they're probably looking elsewhere outside the organization. So better to promote them a little bit before than to wait too long.
Right, right. After reading that book and some of the books by Anthony Bourdain,
Mm-hmm.
it gave me a brand new appreciation for just what a chaos factory a restaurant is in the back.
Mm-hmm.
They're dealing with just a million things at once. It just amazing to me.
Yeah, yeah. That's why you got to watch The Bear, Ron, because the Bear is exactly about that. And oh, by the way, this book is featured in The Bear. In fact, Will Guidera has a cameo in season 3. So
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Will and other chefs have a cameo in season 3. So it's really fun. But we are up against our first break. Want to remind you that you can get a hold of Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. Of course, the website is The Soul of Enterprise, where you can see show notes as well as previews to upcoming shows. We want to make sure that you can visit our Patreon channel too, patreon.com/TSOE. There you can get our show commercial free without the Greg Kite commercials, as well as also our bonus episodes, which are Ron and I do after every regular show. We, at a certain level, you can get a shout out like Blake Oliver did. You want to check him out at Blake Oliver at Earmark CPE. That's earmarkcpe.com. But right now, a word from our sponsors. And we are back on the Soul of Enterprise. And Ron, we are doing down our countdown of our best books of 2024. Note, best books, not best business books, just so everyone's clear. And I'm gonna go off the beaten path here, Ron. And my number 4 book is not a business book, and it is a book that I know you are well acquainted with. I don't know if you read it or not, but we've talked a lot about it, especially on the bonus episodes, and that is Amor Towles, A Gentleman in Moscow.
Yes.
So my number 4 book, by the way, the series with Ewan McGregor is absolutely fantastic as well. Highly recommend it. They do a great job being faithful to the book. This is another one where I listened to this one rather than read it, and it was just marvelous. It was not read by the author; it was read by a professional. I guess author or reader. I forget. I don't know what they call them now. And he was just fantastic. I'll give you some quotes. I mean, he really it's a fantastic story. Just a quick setup. It's a guy who was a count in Tsarist Russia. He is attributed to having written a poem that was contributed to the revolution. So when the Soviets take over, he's not killed, but he's sentenced to spend the rest of his days at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, and that's his prison sentence, so to speak. He starts out there and is still the count. By the end, he ends up on the wait staff because they take more and more of his privileges away, but he's also looking for stuff to do because he becomes bored out of his skull staying in one place. But you think, what could possibly happen to this guy if over the course of 40 years that this book evolves, and he is only in one place the whole time. But it is just really a pleasure to read. And here's some just quick snippets. If patience wasn't so easily tested, then it would hardly be a virtue. And this is of course right out of existential philosophy. But if a man does not master his circumstances, then he is bound to be mastered by them. That's a way of stating the great Viktor Frankl quote: "He who has a why to live can bear anyhow." Of course, Viktor Frankl is talking about concentration camp, but in this particular case, this is just talking about his life cooped up in the Metropole Hotel. One of my favorite scenes in the book, and they do it really, really well in the series, is every night the Count comes and orders his dinner, and he orders a bottle of wine. And so when he orders the wine, he's always expertly pairing it with whatever happens to be the fillet of sole or whatever the special is for the day. And one of the guys who's clearly a KGB agent reporting back is another waiter, and he is obviously a Soviet, and it gets really ticked off that the Count is so good with all of these wines that he reports back to Moscow, and it suddenly turns out he shows up and he says, "Will you have wine with dinner tonight?" And he says, "Yes, I'll have a bottle of blah, 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 blah." And he goes, "No, we only have red or white." He says, "What do you mean red or white?" He says that red or white, that in their infinite wisdom, the Soviets stripped off all of the labels from all of the wines in the cellar, and they could only tell you whether they had red or white wine. So but that's the kind of an example of what happens in this book, and you just go, that's a really interesting way that he plays that. And last, I want a great quote here. He said, "Our lives are steered by uncertainties, many of which are disrupted or even daunting, but that if we persevere and remain generous of heart, we may be granted a moment of lucidity, a moment in which all that has happened to us suddenly comes into focus as a necessary course of events, even as we find ourselves on the threshold of life that we meant to lead all along."
Yeah.
Beautiful stuff.
He is such a great author. I remember hearing him on Russ Roberts, and Russ said, he's read all 3 of his books. At the time, he had 3 out, and Russ said, "But Gentleman in Moscow is my favorite." So, of course, I went out and read it and was blown away. My dad loves it. I didn't see the series, but I have read the book.
Okay.
My dad has read his other 2 books, and now he just read a 3rd book, which is a collection of short stories that my dad says he just is phenomenal. The guy has just got away with words.
Yeah.
Yeah, just beautiful. So yeah, that's a great pick. My number 4, Ed, is a guy we both heard on Russ, and I think Barry Weiss had him on the Honestly podcast, and I've heard
Mm-hmm.
of, I think even Nick might have talked to him. I can't remember on Reason, but it's Marty Makari's The Doctor, Blind
Mm.
Spots, When Medicine Gets It Wrong. And this book is amazing. I mean, just amazing. It's basically talking about the systemic flaws in medicine caused by groupthink and resistance to change. And it's example after example of what the medical community got wrong, including public health officials. And I'm thrilled to say that Marty is going to be the new FDA commissioner. I think it's Trump's best single selection so far
Mm-hmm.
of his cabinet. I mean, this guy is a true scientist. He goes where the evidence takes him. Just a few examples of what medicine has screwed up. Peanut allergies have exploded in the USA, but nowhere else in the world. Not in Israel, not in Africa, because pediatricians were telling parents, don't give your kids anything peanut. They weren't able to build up immunity to it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why we have the peanut problem that we do. No other country faces this, except we've had an explosion of it. Um, the misdiagnosis of ovarian cancer. You got cancer of the ovaries. No, it's cancer of the fallopian tubes.
Mm-hmm.
And because they stuck to their misdiagnosis, they didn't do effective prevention. You can remove the fallopian tubes during other types of procedures, which probably, he advocates should be done. The overuse of antibiotics. He thinks it's wreaking havoc with our microbiomes in our gut. He said, look, if these antibiotics they're so effective at killing all this bacteria, what are they doing to our gut?
Mm-hmm.
And he says more research is needed. He makes the same argument about fluoride. Fluoride, okay, great. I understand. It kills bacteria in your mouth. What's it doing to our microbiome? And I've since learned, Ed, that only about 2/3 of communities have fluoride in the water. It's not 100%.
No.
And it's not 100% across the world. And I do think it warrants more research, and that's what he's calling for. And then hormone replacement therapy. It was abandoned because a flawed study linked it to cancer and strokes, breast cancer and
Mm-hmm.
strokes. And those studies were absolutely flawed, but this myth held on for 10, 15 years. In fact, he says it still exists today. And he says, done right for the right people, which is the majority, hormone replacement therapy is a wonderful thing for women
Mm-hmm.
within 5 years of menopause or something. So anyway, just example after example. It reminds me of the ulcer, the two doctors in the ulcer wars, and that said, ulcers were not caused by stress; they're caused by bacteria in the gut. They came up with a cocktail of antibiotics. They fixed it, and the whole medical community shunned them for 10 years. Wouldn't let them speak at conferences. Couldn't get their paper published, and they went on to win the Nobel Prize of Medicine for medicine. And of course, you and I did a show, episode 178, on the book Bad Medicine
Mm-hmm.
by David Wooten, that went through all the history of the rejection of antibiotics, germ theory, sodium pentothal, ether to put people out. Doctors were very, very slow to change. And Makari's message is, look, we have poor communication. We should be honest with the patients, tell them we don't know. We should show epistemic humility, is basically what he's saying. This is a phenomenal book. I've recommended it to all my family. I said, you need to read this book.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really worth reading. It's an incredible book.
Yeah, definitely great stuff. Well, Ron, I'm going to get my number 3 in quickly before our next break here. We've got about 3 minutes left, but it's a book that you and I, it could be on your list. This is the Heart of a Cheetah by Magat Wade. How we've been lied to about African poverty and what it means for human flourishing. Show number 486 is when we interviewed Magat about this book. just fantastic. She is absolutely one of my heroes, and not to beat a point because we have done an entire show on it, but here's some of the sample of this. She just pulls no punches in this book. Anti-capitalist intellectuals, both in Africa and abroad, endlessly repeat a victimhood narrative about Africa being poor due to slavery, colonialism, and ongoing exploitation. Yes, Africa has been victimized, but unless and until these same intellectual forces articulate and endorse the positive capitalist path forward, which will let us leave that past behind, they are both part of the problem, not part of the solution. They are the bad guys.
Yep.
Okay.
Ed, that was my number 3 as well.
No way.
Yeah, I kid you not. Heart of a Cheetah. The thing that really got me about this is she goes through the reasons for Africa's poverty. Obviously, she's like us. She agrees the only cure for this is wealth creation. What creates wealth? It's not formal education. She destroys that point, which I love, because you build wealth first, then you create the Harvards and all. It's not the cause and effect's the opposite. And then she talks about the energy crisis with, all this unreliable wind and solar energy. She goes, we need nuclear, we need fossil fuel, so we don't have to, cook with charcoal inside the house, which is killing people. And I love the fact that also she got into the history of Africa, which was all free market in their They have a long history of free market. And I'll tell you, when I was going through my notes on her book, she's right. I am incredibly bullish on Africa, because she says by 2050, they'll have 25% of the global population. If they can unleash their entrepreneurial spirit, the soul of enterprise, to borrow a phrase, they will be a force to reckon with, the African continent. And I can't wait for the day. I hope I live to see some of it.
Yep. Yeah. No, fantastic stuff. So businesses create jobs, she says. Jobs pay people money. And when Africans have money, they will no longer be poor.
I love my God.
It's really not that hard, guys. This is how this works. Well, that's amazing.
Yeah. Such a great story.
But we are up against our break. Juan, want to remind our listeners they can get a hold of either one of us by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. We would love for you to go out and rate this podcast, and you can do that by going to ratethispodcast.com/TSOE, because that lets other people find the show. We promise to read all of our reviews, good, bad, or indifferent, on the air. But right now, a word from our sponsors. It is time for Best Books 2024. Ron, we have been counting them down. One of my favorite shows to do and prepare for, just because you get a chance to look back on all of the stuff that you've read in that particular year. I'm sure we might have some honorable mentions in the last segment, but let's make sure we get our number twos in so we can set up number ones properly. My number two book on the year, I read the last 3 days of the year because it was given to me as a Christmas present. And it was on my list. It is not one that you can get on Kindle. You must buy the hardback copy of it because it's an old book. It was published in 1998. I can't believe I hadn't come across this book. I talked about this with my mentor, Howard Hansen, this morning on our call, and he hadn't heard of it either, even though there's a quote that I'm going to share with everybody that I shared with Howard, and he said, oh, man, I wish I had that one 20 years ago because it's absolutely fantastic. It is by Gordon MacKenzie, and it is called Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Yep. Just fantastic title. Orbiting the Giant Hairball. Gordon MacKenzie was an employee at the Hallmark. I think he started out in the creative area where he was designing cards and stuff. He ended up with the title of Holy Man and Creative Paradox. That was his last title. So the metaphor of orbiting the giant hairball is this. He says any organization is like a hairball. It has to have at least two pieces of hair, and they start to get intertwined with one another. A skein, if you will, one of my favorite words. And more hairballs get added to them. And as you add more and more to the hairballs, it gets bigger and bigger density like a planet. Says the problem is that as individual employees, you have a choice. You can either become part of the hairball, and you just get stuck in there. And now you're just one of the many hairs that's part of this giant hairball thing. Or you can try to, what he says, orbit the hairball, because you can't fly too far out of orbit. If you fly too far out of orbit, you go off and on your own into the nethers of space, and you're never heard from again. So it's a very delicate balance. And this very much reminded of me of my career as Sage, in that I orbited the giant hairball for quite some time. It ended this year, but he has some really fantastic insights in here. He talks about on the pyramid structure of organizations. He says, let's remind ourselves that pyramids are tombs. I think by the way, I sent that quote to Mark Koziel, the now incoming president of and CEO of the AICPA, because I think, they always talk about the pyramid structure is over. The pyramid structure is over. I think that, the pyramids are tombs. But he has this term, which is very similar to Howard's non-anxious presence. He calls it compassionate emptiness. He says when he was dealing with a lot of people who would come into his office, because what he did, he's just literally would sit around and wait for people to come into his office and ask him stuff. I think he was like a shaman, right? But he said, hey, he had to listen to them with in a spirit of what he called compassionate emptiness. I had to be compassionate, but I had to empty myself of all of my preconceived notions, because most of the time they just wanted to listen. So lastly, two quick quotes I want to share. One, he says, it is not the business of authority figures to validate genius, because genius threatens authority. The ghost of past successes outvotes original thinking.
Man, that's right out of Rory Sutherland.
Right, exactly. And this last one, and this is the one that I shared with Howard, and we both resonated with when we talked about, he's talking about presentations that he had to give, a specific presentation that he did. He said, I felt disappointment at my sense of relief over receiving good evaluations. I have always wanted my acts of rebellion, and this workshop had been such an act, to be met with approval, and at the same time, I have always been disappointed when such approval is bestowed.
That's our colleague Dan Morris's. That's one of his all-time favorite books. He read that probably back in '98 when it came out, because I remember him telling me about it and just raving about it. And that's awesome. I need to read that book. I love it. Very cool. All right, Ed, my number two book I learned about when I visited with my dad when I was out there. We went to Pooler, Georgia, and we went to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum that's in Pooler, Georgia, and
Okay.
it is amazing. They have a B-17 in there, along with a bunch of other planes. And of course, the Mighty Eighth was what the Masters of the Air series on Apple was based on. And Spielberg and Hanks, that did that movie, they visited the Mighty Eighth. In fact, they used the B-17 they have there for the engine noises in the movie to be as realistic as possible, because the plane they have in there was completely rebuilt. I mean, tens of thousands of hours of labor to rebuild the plane to get it to operate again. Anyway, when we walked in, the docent greeted us and gave us a little background on the museum, where stuff was. And he said, if you're interested, he says, I'm only going to recommend one book when you get into the bookstore. He said, A Higher Call, an incredible true story of combat and chivalry in the war-torn skies of World War II by a guy named Adam Makos, published in 2012, I believe. It is an unbelievable story. I cannot believe that they haven't made a movie about this or a series yet. Probably it could be done in a movie, but it is the story of an encounter between an American bomber pilot, Charlie Brown, literally, and a German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, in December 1943. Brown's flying the B-17 Fortress. It's been severely damaged by anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. His crew was wounded. He had people dying in the back of the plane, and had a wing torn off. Engine was out. It's smoking. The Frank Stigler, the Luftwaffe, and he's a Luftwaffe ace pilot, so he shot down a lot of these B-17s because that's one of the reasons they had such a high mortality rate. He flies next to him and he sees the wounded people in the plane. He knows they're hurting. He knows they're probably not going to make it back to their base. He was going to fire on them and just take them out. He escorts them out of German airspace and lets them return to base, and they did make it. By itself, that's an amazing act of just, I mean, chivalry, morality, compassion, and also honor. I mean, that's a true military person, honor the enemy type of thing. The book goes into the backstories of each pilot, but the most amazing thing is years later, way after the war, these two find each other and have a meeting. And I tell you, the last pages of this book, you'll be bawling your eyes out. It is the most amazing thing. If you do read this book, make sure you read all the footnotes and make sure you go to the author's website. He's got a video of them meeting and then sitting down in a hotel room talking to one another. These two, fighter pilots. Just absolutely amazing. And the thing that blew my mind that I learned was the Luftwaffe and the German Air Force. They had absolute disdain for the Nazis. They did not wear the swastikas on their uniform. They didn't do the Hitler salute, and they didn't wear the swastikas on their uniform. They had the traditional insignias of the German military. So they didn't feel
the Iron Cross and that stuff.
Yeah, the Iron Cross they would wear when they earned those.
Because that predated the Nazis.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And it's this book, and the cover of this book is a reproduction. Somebody painted it of the B-17 flying, and you can see the German pilot on their wing. And it's an amazing photograph. The book just blew my mind. Me and my dad sat, when we got back home to his house, we sat there and we were both reading it, and he was ahead of me. And he said, wait till you get to the ending. You're just going to be bawling your eyes out. And he was absolutely right. I mean, it's the most amazing story. I can't believe a movie hasn't been made. Somebody needs to make this movie.
Sounds it's like it would be paired well with the Unbroken. Did you ever read that book or read that movie? And so that's about a bomber pilot who goes down in the Pacific and becomes a prisoner of war of the Japanese. Of course, it's the opposite. He is maltreated, especially by this one particular Japanese officer, and who makes him stand with a plank over it, like Jesus on the cross for hours. And he, of course, remained. Louis Zamperini is the guy's name. And Louis Zamperini became a singer, I think, for Billy Graham. Like he was, and he was also an Olympian back before World War II. Anyway, similar in that he goes back and he meets the Japanese officer who basically tortured him for all of these years. Wow. And they didn't become friends or anything like that, but there was a act of meeting and forgiveness among this guy, because I mean this guy, the Japanese officer was going well beyond his duty. He wasn't just doing his duty as an officer. He was a psychopath, or was caught up in it and felt very ashamed of it later in his life. So it sounds like it'd be a good companion.
Yeah. It reminds me of when some of the Vietnam vets, were brought back to Vietnam and got to meet some of their enemies, and it's just an incredibly inspiring story. Just amazing, a great book, A Higher Call.
Okay. Have you watched the series, Ron?
I watched I think I watched the first 3 episodes. So I'm not done with it, but I did watch the first 3 episodes.
Yeah,
and it was good.
It's well shot. Done. Yeah, well done. And even the CGI of the dog fights and stuff, they did a really good job with it.
I love one of the scenes where they think they're going back to England, and he says, "Oh crap, we're over France."
Yeah.
The navigator was throwing up in the back, his air sickness.
Yes. All right. Well, after the break, Ron, we will reveal our number 1 books and maybe have a couple of honorable mentions as well. But we want to remind our listeners that they can get a hold of Ron or me by sending an email to asktsoe@verisage.com. And yes, that website is The Soul of Enterprise. Show notes, previews to upcoming shows as well. I want you to check out our Patreon channel, rate this podcast, all of those good things. But I want a special call out here to our sponsor, Woodard. We really appreciate all of the work that they have done with and for us, and we look forward to the continued relationship. Check out Woodard at woodard.com. And now a word from our sponsors, including Woodard. And on the Soul of Enterprise, we are counting down our top 5 books of 2024, and it is time for the big reveal. Ron, we are down to our number 1 books. We'll save honorable mentions if we have some time, and we can certainly do them on the bonus episode. So those of you who want to can subscribe to the Patreon channel and get those bonus books that we talk about as well. Ron, my number 1 book of the year is by Jessica Houghton Wilson, but it is really sort of not by her so much as it is a book in which she took the last unfinished work of Flannery O'Connor and then put it together and with some commentary and kind of filled in the story gaps. So the name of the book is Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? And I happen to be a huge fan of Flannery O'Connor, and it's actually one of the things that I am most grateful to the brothers and priests that I had back at Chaminade High School for introducing me to Flannery O'Connor. Flannery O'Connor, for those of you who don't know, it was from the state of Georgia, very Southern woman, but she was Catholic and extremely Catholic, and she wrote these Gothic short stories and novels. I think she had a total of 3 novels, including the third unfinished one, which is Why Do the Heathen Rage? And she is just an unbelievable writer. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Gothic novel otherwise, but Flannery O'Connor is just excellent in that she incorporates the concepts of the sacred into oftentimes grotesque stories. So here's an example of that. This is from Why Did Heathen Rage? And it's a little setup of the story. It's about this poor Southern family. And in this particular case, the she said is the mother. There's a father whose name is Tillman. And then they're talking about their son. So let me read this quote. He's a scholar, she said. She had arrived at this term for his semi-occupation as a genteel shield for his peculiarities. She referred to it as intellectual. Oh, she preferred it to intellectual. She thought a scholar sounded like someone who knew too much, but remained a gentleman with it all. An intellectual just knew too much. To Tillman, a scholar meant a schoolboy, a diller, a dollar, a 10 o'clock scholar. He's a goddamn idler, that's what he is, Tillman said. He contributes, she said bitterly. You can't say he doesn't contribute to the expenses. To keep himself busy and to help pay her board, Walter tended to a liquor store on Highway 22 every night from 6 to 12. So it's just this disparity of what the mother thought about him and what he actually was, right? And her stories are all filled with this. But let me share this one with you because this really jumped out at me. If we have time, I have a couple of more quotes that I want to share, but let me just talk about this one. And keep in mind, this was written in the early 1960s, so before Flannery O'Connor passed away from lupus. By the way, she didn't live very long. She lived, I think, only until like 32 or 33. So here's the quote. Tillman sat before the television for an hour every evening before supper and glared at the news of the day. Each day's news blended into a continuous affront like a raucous song made of senseless insults. Every evening, he recharged his battery of rage before the machine. How great is that?
That's awesome. That's awesome.
So Flannery O'Connor's Why Did the Heathen Rage by Jessica Houghton Wilson. Can't recommend it enough, especially if you're into Gothic novels. So there you go.
I've been reading her name forever, Ed. Everybody talks about her. Loves her.
Oh,
loves
gosh.
her work. I've never read anything by her, but it's kind of like Jane Austen. You know how you hear her name all the time? Mm-hmm. That's how I feel about Flannery. But yeah, that's great. All right, my number 1 book is, you probably could have guessed it. I'm not sure if you read this. I know you read the first edition. Okay. But he updated it. And there's a foreword by Dennis Prager. It came out last year, The Israel Test. How Israel's genius enriches and challenges the world, by, of course, my 43-year-old mentor, George Gilder. It's amazing. It documents the extraordinary achievements in technology, entrepreneurship, and innovation, particularly in cybersecurity, medical advancements, and agriculture. And it's a global hub for startups, with more companies listed on the NASDAQ than any other country outside the US. I mean, Gilder argues, and I think incredibly persuasively, that the world needs Israel. The world, period. I mean, they have so many innovations baked into products. What was that line that you said? We make what you buy better, or what we make the products you buy better. Israel's full of that, especially in the medical field. We've talked about how they're per capita the #1 innovative country in the world. The free enterprise and creativity thrive amid geopolitical hostility, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. That you've got this oasis in the desert of that small little country, the size of New Jersey or whatever, and it just thrives. Amid all this chaos and enemies around it. And then, of course, Gilder asks his famous Israel test. How do you respond to others' success, creativity, and wealth? In other words, are you envy-driven? Do you think it's zero-sum? Do you think Israel's stolen it, or do you think they've created it? He also talks a lot about rejecting victimhood narratives and embrace systems that reward creativity. He sees Israel as a beacon of excellence and challenges readers to celebrate human ingenuity and view wealth as the result of innovation and enterprise rather than redistribution. It is a phenomenal update to the first edition. And obviously, he's writing in a time of, after October 7th. So it was a really.
Is that when he updated it, Ron? He updated it after October 7th?
I think he did, yes. And it came out last year. I forget the month, but I read everything by Gilder that I know about, and I really loved it. It's just a great exploration of Israel's just a resilience and just entrepreneurial spirit. It's an amazing accomplishment. So
yeah, well, my quote that I can remember for I think the first edition, although maybe he said this in a previous book, you'll know. The good fortune of others is also one's own. Is that
that was in Israel Test? It's in this one too. That's the golden rule of capitalism.
Yes.
Yes.
The good fortune of others is also one's own, which I think is such an important point. But so he's updated. Like, did he revisit any of the companies that he talked about in the first Israel Test, and to kind of give us an update on what happened with some of them?
He did not so much revisited. I think he named some new ones. Because he's Gilder, and that's what he does. He's always searching out new companies. So. I didn't go back and compare it to the old version from 14 or whatever it was, but it's worth just reading again with fresh eyes because it's Gilder. I mean, he's such a great writer. But
right, and you've reached out with him trying to get him back on, right?
Yes, and I know he's working on a book, Ed, on graphene.
Really?
Yes, he's working on the graphene. I think he's calling it the graphene economy or something like that. It's got graphene in the title. So now we've got the transformation economy and the graphene economy. But yeah, he's really doing that deep dive with that entrepreneur who's got that firm, and it's in Canada, but I think it's got labs in Texas as well, right? That he talked about when he was on the show talking about his book, Life After Capitalism, where he profiles that graphene company.
Right. Yeah, really good stuff. Well, as always, Ron, this is fantastic to go through our best books. I love doing the show. I love preparing for the show. I love hearing what you have to say about yours. And I think, again, probably less overlap than we've had in the past. Usually we have like 2, sometimes even 3 that have overlapped. So in this case, we have a really good list. But 9 books, I guess, total on the list because we only had one duplicate. So
right, and only interviewed one person, Magat, basically. If you don't count Gilder, but we've had Gilder on 4 times or 3 or 4 times. So
yeah. So anyway. There you go.
So what do we have next week, Ed?
Next week, Ron, we're going to talk about pricing spinometers or spinometers. I don't know. I'm not quite sure how to say it. We'll have to ask him. And that'll be our second interview with author Tim Smith and pricing expert. So
I love Tim. I saw him in Vegas last year at the PPS conference. He's a great guy. I can't wait. It'll be a great show. See you in 167 hours.
This has been The Soul of Enterprise, Business in the Knowledge Economy. sponsored by Woodard. Building your ideal practice with coaching, education, community, and resources. Join us next week on Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, that's noon Pacific. In the meantime, please feel free to visit us on the web at www.thesoulofenterprise.com.